Today, we're going to be looking at column pinning and freezing in a .NET data grid. If you have any questions during this series or during this webinar, you can just use the chat feature and we'll get to them at the end. So today's topic is column pinning and freezing in a .NET data grid. So you might be wondering, what is that feature exactly? Well, it's a common feature that people are used to in Microsoft Excel. If you've ever used Excel, you know that there's an ability to freeze the different rows and columns of the spreadsheets. And why would you want to freeze the rows? Like, let's say you're working with a very large spreadsheet and you have lots of data and you're editing some cell way over in the P column and you want to know what data value does it belong to that might be over in the A column or the B column. So what you can do in Excel is you can freeze the panes. Now, Excel kind of gives you three options here. You can freeze the panes based upon where the selected cell is. So if I select this cell that says oranges and I click freeze panes, what that's going to do is it's going to essentially freeze all the rows and columns above and to the left of the cell that I selected. And as I scroll, the frozen rows and columns stay in place. Excel also has a quick ability just to freeze the top row or the first column, because that's the most common scenario where you just want to keep the headers visible as you scroll. It's actually very common to freeze the top row as you're more likely to have more rows than you are columns, so that you can scroll through large data sets and then see the column headers at the top. So this is a feature that's really common in data grids. Data grids often, try to mimic the Excel experience, that you can put those features into your .NET applications. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio and we're going to show how to implement this in a .NET data grid. So here I have a .NET 6 application using Windows Forms. And I'm going to be using the ComponentOne FlexGrid control. So to add it, I'm going to go to my NuGet package manager and I'm going to browse for the c1.win.flexgrid package. And since I'm using a .NET 6 application here, I'm going to select the 6.0 version and install it to my application. And when these things pop up, you're going to accept, the license terms or whatever. And that will install the package for my application. And now when I open the form at design time, you will see that the control is now magically added to my toolbox over here, C1 FlexGrid. I'm going to go ahead and drag that to my form. And what I always like to do is dock it in the parent container just to fill the space. So here I have a FlexGrid. It's ready to go. I am going to yada yada over adding data to this data grid, since I just want to focus on freezing rows and columns. So I've already added a data source here. We can go ahead and run the application and show what the data is going to look like in this data grid without any column freezing. And there we have it. So as you're working with this data set here, it's looking like we have some orders from our database. And as I scroll the data grid to the right, it'd be really nice if I could keep that order ID visible as I scroll over. So let's say I'm editing, a cell over here deeper into the data grid. I don't know what order it belongs to unless I can keep it frozen on the left. So let's go ahead and implement that in our data grid. Now, column freezing and row freezing is a pretty common feature. Most data grids support it. Even the even the standard .NET data grid view supports it. But as you'll see with FlexGrid, we're going to be able to do a lot more than just enabling column and row freezing. So to freeze the columns, we're going to set the calls.frozen property of our FlexGrid. So the calls property gives you access to the columns collection, and there is a frozen property, which is an integer. So it's just going to take a number. And what that value means is how many columns should be frozen. We're going to just freeze one column. Now, it's interesting that you can't really specify which columns are frozen, and that's because it's always going to freeze whatever column is on the left. Now, you can also freeze rows using the rows property. I'm not going to do that for this demo, but that is the API available there. So now let's go ahead and run this again. And let's see what it looks like with one column frozen. And there we have it. And by default, FlexGrid will shade the frozen cells a little differently. And we can customize that, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But as we can see here, now we can scroll the data grid, and our order ID is frozen. Now, what if we want to allow our end user to freeze the rows? So this is nice. The developer can set this in the application before we build it, but now that it's running, what if the end user says, I don't want this column frozen. I want to freeze 2 columns, or I want to freeze this other column over here. FlexGrid has a handy feature called allow freezing. So there's a property called allow freezing. And what this does is this controls the runtime capabilities for freezing. And there are several options available. We have the ability to allow freezing just columns, allow freezing just rows, allow freezing nothing, which is the default property, or allow freezing both rows and columns. So here I'm going to set it to both so I can show you what this looks like at runtime when we are allowing both rows and columns to be frozen at runtime. So now, of course, by default, we have the one frozen column. But now if I hover close to the edge of this cell, I see a new little icon appear that looks like it's a little lock and these 2 little black bars. Now I can drag this at runtime, and now I can freeze multiple columns. Now, and even with the rows, even though I have 0 rows frozen at the current moment, I can go ahead and up here until I see this little icon, and I can drag down, and I can freeze some rows. Now, the next thing your end user may be wondering is, now what if I want to freeze the order ID and I want to freeze the order date? Now, the problem is that the order date is our 4th column here. We could, freeze all the columns up to that point, like this. But now, maybe that solution is not really what we want. I mean, what if we want to freeze the ship postal code over here? We can't just freeze the entire data grid. It would be unusable. So one thing that the end user can do is that they can drag and reorder the columns. So for example, if let's say I did want to freeze the, let's say the ship date here, I can just go ahead and drag that column over to the left where it's closer to, a freezing area. It's really cold over here on the left. And then, now I can freeze the shipping date like that. Now, FlexGrid actually has another feature that's built in that you can enable with just one property, and that's what we call pinning. And pinning is a quick and easy way that lets the user freeze any column in the data grid without even having to drag the columns. So to enable that feature, we're going to set the allow pinning property. Now, the allow pinning property has a few options. So the options here are column range, none, and single column. Now let me explain these a little bit. So what column range does is that whenever you pin a column, it's going to pin and freeze all of the columns from the left of the grid to the one that you pin. Single column is probably the most useful option here. And single column allows you to pin any single column one by one. You can still pin multiple columns, but the behavior works by pinning just one at a time, and the grid will actually automatically move it for you so that the user doesn't have to drag it over themselves. So let me demonstrate single column first here. So when you enable the pinning feature, you'll notice that there's a little pinning icon that displays at the top of the column header. Now that little icon is just the default icon. You can customize it using the glyphs property of FlexGrid. But now I no longer have to, drag this and drag the columns around. Let's say I want to freeze the required date column. All I have to do is click the little pin icon, and now that column is automatically moved and frozen in place, just like that. So that's the single column. Now let me just show you what the column range looks like. So So the column range behavior works like this. If I want to freeze the required date, when I pin it, you'll notice all of the columns from the left to that column get pinned and frozen. So that one's probably not as useful because that's the same as just dragging the bar over. But just wanted to show all the different options that are available to you. Now, one last thing I mentioned before, the style of the cell. One of the nice things about FlexGrid is that you can customize a lot of things at design time. In fact, you could probably set those properties that I set in code as well in the property editor. But what I'm going to show you here is the style editor of the FlexGrid at design time. So if you open up the little smart tag and you click on styles, this opens up a little editor where you can choose all of the different styles for FlexGrid. The alternating row, highlighting, focus, the editor. And one of the styles is called frozen. And this is where you'll see where that beige color is coming from. So if I could remove that, or I could set it to some other color, whatever we want the frozen columns and rows to look like. And that's it. That is basically column pinning and freezing in a .NET Datagrid. So now I'm going to open this up to any questions to see if we have any interesting questions. So, of course, here I have been showing this just in WinForms, but we do have this feature available in every version of FlexGrid. The column freezing feature is supported in every version of FlexGrid. However, the different runtime features, like being able to drag the bar over, adding the pinning, that is different based upon which platform. Like, for example, in WPF, we have the same features available, but Blazor, those features are not available, at least not available yet. All right, it looks like we don't have any other questions. So we can wrap up today. Thank you for joining this streaming session, and I'll look forward to seeing you